Hey everyone, it's Anna and welcome back to my booktube channel, or welcome if you're new, come on in. Those of you who have been watching for a while may have noticed I've done some bookshelf reorganizing behind me. I've got all of my poetry books finally out and unpacked over a year after moving into this house. I couldn't be happier with the way that this turned out, and my husband and I are currently in the middle of reorganizing / finishing unpacking all of the books that we still had not completely unpacked or organized from when we moved into this house over a year ago at this point. So it's been definitely a big project, but I have been thoroughly enjoying it as well. And it has also helped me kind of keep tabs on some books that I had purchased but hadn't yet read, things that were kind of languishing in boxes that I'm like, oh, that's where you went. And so today I'm going to talk about some of those books with you. This is kind of a summer reading check-in, roughly from like books that I finished in about mid to late July up until this like early August period where you'll be seeing it now. We got a pretty good mix of genres, library books versus purchased books, all that sort of thing. But I have right now 9 books that I'm going to talk to you about. So the first one is The 7 Wonders of the Ancient World, An Extraordinary New Journey Through History's Greatest Treasures by Bettany Hughes. This is the first book that I have read by this author. I gather she's an academic who writes a lot about the ancient world. And this one we read for a nonfiction book club that we joined recently, which was super fun. I really enjoyed getting to meet the people that were in the book club and have just a good discussion with them. I don't think I've been in some sort of like nonfiction type book club before, so that was also a fun new experience for me. But yeah, this is a very accessible to the general public book about the 7 wonders of the ancient world, what they are, why they matter. Full of lots of fascinating information about how they were constructed, what their relevance is today. I would say that like this is definitely a great book if you are interested in the topic at all, or if you like to read about history but you prefer it to not be the more dry names and dates style of things. This is definitely more of a cultural history. I would say that my major critique of this book was that the quality of the writing is a little bit uneven throughout. There's a lot of run-on sentences and sentence fragments in it, which bothers me because since this is a nonfiction book, I get that it can be written in a more informal style since it's not written for academics. But normally if you have a bunch of run-ons or fragments, it's being used for a literary purpose, and it just wasn't in this book, so that really bothered me. I feel like that was something that an editor could have very easily fixed with this book, so I don't know about that. And then also just like the first chapter or 2 of the book, I really wasn't quite sure what to make of it because a lot of the writing seemed very unfocused, or the author would just go off on a bunch of different historical tangents within even the same paragraph, and I was just like, okay, what are we doing here? I'm somebody that, my degree is in English and classical studies, so I was familiar with a decent amount of what she writes about in the first chapter with the Great Pyramid of Giza, thanks to the archaeology classes that I took in college, and I was like, I know what's going on here, but this would be really hard to follow if I was not as familiar with the subject matter. But thankfully that kind of tightened up over the course of the book and we rallied, enjoyed the book. I would like to read something else that this author has written, maybe her book about Socrates or her book about the city Istanbul. All right, next, why don't we talk about, this is one of those books I was saying I had just like found languishing in a box. This is Lead in the Mist by Hope Miralles. And this is I would say, like completely underappreciated classic of the fantasy genre. This was originally published in 1926, and the author was a contemporary of Virginia Woolf and the other Bloomsbury group writers. She shows up apparently in a lot of their diaries and letters that they wrote. But this book was utterly delightful. It is one of the best fantasy books I have ever read in my life, and I can't believe that I have not heard anyone talk about this. So if you've read this, please let me know because I need somebody to talk to about this book. So this follows Nathaniel Chanticleer, who is this sort of fine, upstanding mayor of the town and senator of Lud in the Mist, but he is also kind of known for being a bit of a melancholic dreamer. And this is a world in which the sort of fairy world and the magic of the world has kind of retreated in the face of logic and the law and modernity. So it's definitely kind of a metaphor for like magic going out of the world in the modern age, and written in 1926. So here we go. So Nathaniel just kind of has a life where he's wondering, is there anything, like, is that all there is to it? Is there anything more to life than this? But then something mysterious begins to happen when his younger son eats the forbidden fairy fruit that he isn't supposed to, and his daughter goes missing into the wilds of fairyland, and it is up to Nathaniel to start trying to figure out what's happening to his kids. Why is this mysterious doctor going around and causing like trouble within the village, and just kind of what is going on. And he is the only person that's really able to do this because he is taking the existence of magic in the world very seriously. I loved this book. It's written in kind of almost an old-fashioned capital R romantic style, which I think was kind of unusual for the 1920s at that point. It was definitely not the style of prose that was in vogue, or if you've read any of like Virginia Woolf's novels, you might be more used to something like that. But it was really funny. It honestly kind of reminded me of some of the Jane Austen style comedy of manners, yet it was also strikingly modern in the way it wrote about a lot of different things. As I was reading this, I couldn't help but imagine how I would want to adapt this into a movie, and I think I came down that I would love to see this adapted into a movie directed by Yorgos Lanthimos and with the doctor character played by Willem Dafoe, because there's an amazing page-long monologue that character has at the end of the book that I couldn't picture anybody else performing that other than Willem Dafoe. So, like I said, this is definitely a great book. I'd highly recommend it. Still trying to find somebody else that I know that has read this. So if you have, please let me know. We can gush about this. Or if you didn't like it, I'd be interested to hear why. It seems like some people have had like difficulty reading the book, and I think it might just be because it is prose-wise not really as easy to read as some modern fantasy books, but I really loved it. Next, we had a couple of fun ones. This was another book that was languishing in a box. This was Squeeze Me by Carl Hyacin. This is a sort of like Florida nature mystery social satire book that I had picked up at a library book sale back in Seattle, and I just had not gotten around to reading it yet. And this follows a character named AnnaG Armstrong. She is a wildlife rehomer and rehabilitator that gets caught up in the events surrounding a certain presidential mansion, occasionally known as the Winter White House. There are guests at fundraisers disappearing under mysterious circumstances related to these large invasive pythons that have infiltrated Florida. True story. There are invasive Burmese pythons in the Everglades and other locations throughout Florida, and that's been going on since I was a child. I grew up in Florida, and that was something that was an issue even then. It is only accelerated now. What I loved about this book is it took Carl Hyacin's sort of signature blend of like kooky Florida humor, which I loved when I read his book Hoot as a child. I had never read any of his adult books, so I absolutely loved the sharp as a knife social satire of the current political situation in the United States, the ridiculousness of white feminist, either fascist wannabes or conservative apologists who are relentlessly parodied throughout this book, and also just the tough as nails heroine that he writes in AnnaG. I really related to her a lot, despite the fact that we have very different lives. But I think that this did a wonderful job of balancing the sort of love and appreciation of how weird the state of Florida is with a lot of very insightful commentary on things like the corruption within the state. the fact that there is a lot of greed in real estate development that is destroying places like the Everglades. And this was written in 2021, so this was before we even knew that there was going to be such a thing as the so-called alligator Alcatraz that the current president has built there to detain people that the administration has deemed undesirable. So this is a very good read. It was timely, even though it came out 4 years ago. I wish it was less so, because I wish a lot of things were different about the world that we live in right now. But this is a great book. It made me laugh. Definitely going to keep reading more of his books for adults, and I'm glad I picked that up on a whim. Okay, we are keeping in with the sort of nature theme here. This was a reread for me. This is Track of the Cat, which is a mystery by Nevada Barr. This is another Anna revisits a 30-year-old mystery series. In this case, it's practically juvenile compared to Brother Cadfael, which I think the oldest book is over 40 years old at this point, I think, or close to 40 years old. Anyways, not to get too off topic, but this is a mystery that follows Anna Pigeon, who is a park ranger in the Guadalupe River Valley and Mountains National Parks area, and one day while she is hiking through her route at work, she discovers the dead body of one of her fellow rangers who appears to have been murdered by a large wildcat. However, there are a lot of things about the scene that don't quite add up, and Anna, who is a law enforcement park ranger, which means she's very well trained in the sort of emergency medicine and search and rescue of it all, isn't going to just let an animal take the fall for this when it seems that there was some evidence that a human was actually behind this murder and just trying to get the animal to take the blame for it. I really love this character. She does some things in this book that I'm just like, what on earth were you thinking? This is wild and nuts. But I appreciate how well she is drawn and how a lot of the bold choices that she makes are perfectly in line with the characterization that Nevada Barr has written. Nevada Barr also has worked as a park ranger for many years, and I first encountered these books when I was a teenager. I think my mom and I listened to a few of them together on audio, so I didn't remember a ton of the details of this book. I didn't remember who the murderer was or any of those other types of things. So there are a few things that I want to call out reading this now as an adult, which is that there is some outdated language used surrounding particularly mental illness in this book that I was really not a huge fan of, to be perfectly honest. There is a character who has a history of, it's not specified, but it is some type of mental illness that comes with paranoid delusions. It's not specified if it's schizophrenia or if it's something else like that, but there is a scene in this book that I really do not like where, as part of the murder investigation, somebody else reveals that private medical information of this park ranger who is, a suspect in the murder to the rest of all of the rangers and the staff there. And that really bothered me. Not because I think that it is unrealistic that would ever happen. Unfortunately, that is the kind of thing that happens, but almost from the time that Anna finds out that this character has this mental illness, it causes her to completely second guess or almost discredit the validity of a lot of things that he's said and done, even though, he is a professional, and yes, that might be a compounding factor in his ability to do his job. But up until this point in the novel, we haven't seen that. We've just heard that somebody else thinks that might be a problem. And it really bothered me that there was a character that just let everybody know this private medical information about this person, and they all just judged him so much for it. And I wish that we didn't live in a world where there was still so much stigma against mental illness like that. We kind of still do, though. This is another one of those books like the Carl Hyacin book that also was surprised at 30 years ago just how much she was writing about this corporate greed of real estate developers trying to encroach on public lands, including but not limited to national parks, which we are now seeing the President of the United States think it's acceptable to sell off these public lands to fossil fuel companies logging companies, private developers that do not care about the environment at all. There was a lot in here that reminded me very much of the tensions in one of my favorite nonfiction books, American Wolf, which is about the reintroduction of the American gray wolf into Yellowstone National Park and the sort of conflict that plays out between the wolves, the environmental scientists, the park rangers, and the nearby ranchers. That was very similar to a lot of the conflict in this book that had to do with these sort of big cats that are at the heart of, determining the whodunit of this mystery. Anyways, I really still enjoyed this book, even though I did have an issue with the way that part of the mental illness plot line was handled. I really liked it. I'm going to continue with my reread of the series. I actually have ordered the next 2 books from Thrift Books as I'm slowly kind of assembling my copies from different used book places. So definitely, if you're interested in sort of a park ranger who likes to solve mysteries and has a strong moral compass and sense of justice and might do some dubious things in service of protecting the environment, check out the Anna Pigeon series written by Nevada Barr, and this first book is called Track of the Cat. One more thing, I guess, is just the caveat that this isn't a cozy mystery. I think it's probably pretty clear from my review, but this is not a cozy. This is just like a regular mystery, and yeah, if that's important to you, just know that going in. Okay, next up we have another classic novel that I actually got at a recent trip to one of my favorite used bookstores in the area. It is this beautiful leather-bound Franklin Library edition of The Country of the Pointed Firs by Sarah Orne Jewett. I actually heard about her first through Kendra Gaylord's podcast, Someone Lived Here. She's an architectural history buff that makes videos on YouTube about buildings and architecture, and particularly its intersection with American life. And her podcast was actually posted to YouTube with accompanying photos and videos of her visit to the Sarah Orne Jewett house in Maine. And this book was published in 1896, and I believe it was Willa Cather who said that Sarah Orne Jewett deserves a place with Mark Twain and Ralph Waldo Emerson as one of the preeminent writers of our American literary history. And I had never read anything by her, and figuring out, just based off of the prose that Kendra used in the video to illustrate her writing, I figured, why not give this a try? I was also definitely intrigued by the fact that the author is queer and lived in a committed relationship with another woman during a time when that would have necessarily, of necessity, maybe been a little bit more covert. But basically, this is a story that takes place in the Maine fishing, countryside islands. We follow an unnamed author as our narrator. She is from Boston, and she has taken this trip out to the islands in Maine in order to finish work on one of her novels. And this is a series of vignettes, stories that she hears from the people that she encounters on this trip. Lots of beautiful writing about the natural history of the area, and it is a fascinating portrait to me of a generation that kind of grew up during the heyday of the whaling industry and is now becoming more aged, and our author is writing a lot about these people's stories of what life used to be like and what it is like now. It was a very quiet novel. If she had written this today, I would have said maybe this is more of a vibes novel, but it really is about sinking into this place and the pace of life on these small Maine islands, and I really enjoyed it. I didn't really know what to expect because, like I said, I hadn't read any of this author's books before, but this edition that I have here also has a few of her short stories in the back. So I'll be dipping in and out of that in the weeks and months to come. I also really want to read Deep Haven, which was the novel that Kendra cited a lot in her video. I think I'm going to really enjoy that too. I'll have to find a copy of it, but that's on the list. We're going to now follow that up with what was unfortunately a very disappointing read for me. and that was The Emperor of Gladness by Ocean Vuong. This is Ocean Vuong's most recent release. It is also his second novel. And I think I had mentioned before when I did my book haul where I told you that I had purchased this, I had heard this book was getting kind of mixed reviews. And I can honestly see why. So let me just tell you a little bit about what this book is about. We follow Hai, who is a young Vietnamese American man living in Connecticut during the first term of the Obama presidency, of the Obama administration. He is very much down on his luck. He has just gotten out of rehab for drug addiction. This book deals a lot with that in the context of the ongoing opioid crisis in the United States. And he's just gotten out of rehab and is feeling very much in despair and is at the point where he wants to just take his own life. And he is sort of called back from the brink at the last minute by this older Lithuanian woman, Granzina, who notices the predicament that Hai is in and says, hey, I notice that, you are trying to jump off this bridge. Why don't you come and live with me? I'm old and I need somebody to help take care of me. And this is kind of about their relationship and also Hai's relationship with his family that he's estranged from and his co-workers at this fast casual restaurant he gets a job at. On the one hand, I really respect the scope of what this book was trying to go for. It's tackling a lot of topics as diverse as the experience of working for minimum wage in the United States, which, I have been there, and a lot of the stuff that he writes about in those sections was really very realistic in a way that hurt to read. It also tackles things like the opioid crisis, the ongoing legacy of the Civil War in the United States, what it means to be an immigrant, a refugee. In terms of the themes, the book is very ambitious. In terms of the prose, if you've read Ocean Vuong before, this is going to be a lot more of the same. I think the quality of his prose is incredible and it's very poetic. However, this is a 400-page book that has neither the plot to sustain the fluidity of the prose, nor the level of character growth or exploration or introspection required to sustain a book that is mostly vibes and less plot. I feel like after reading this book, I don't really know anything more about Hai or any of the characters than when I started the book. They didn't really seem like real people to me because they just weren't fleshed out the more time we spent with them. It's very different from his first novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, where the characters are a bit more of stand-ins for ideas than they are meant to be actual people. They're more of a person representing a concept than an actual character, and I just don't think that the development was there to make this really succeed. One of the other things that really just annoyed me about this book is that I think I get the impression that a lot of people were really touched by the relationship between Hai and Grazina, the older lady that he moves in with and begins to take care of, but I just found their entire relationship to be overly sentimental, melodramatic, and kind of overwrought in the way that it was written. Contrast that with the writing that we have between Hai and his relationship with his disabled cousin Sony, who's one of his coworkers at the restaurant, and also with his other coworkers. Those people read a lot more like actual people that had lives, even though we don't see much of that off the page since we're not focusing on them as the main bit of the novel. I think that part rang a lot more true, and I'm not really sure why those relationships were so unevenly developed, especially when it seems to me that we were really supposed to find Hai and Granzina's relationship as the emotional core of the book. It really just didn't work for me, so I can't really say that I recommend this book, which is kind of sad. But it's also okay because I loved Ocean Vuong's previous novel and I loved his 2 poetry collections. So to be honest, I would still recommend him as an author. I just wouldn't say that I recommend this book. So hopefully it's just a sophomore slump of a novel and the next thing he comes out with will be great. I have confidence in that. All right, let's finish off with some library books. So these all kind of unintentionally wound up being a bit related to my Disability Pride Month TBR videos that I had made a little while ago. Only one of these books was actually in there because I had some other library holds come in, but they are all definitely related to the topic. So let's start with, why don't we start with the graphic novel? I have a graphic novel slash memoir slash experiment type book, and a nonfiction book. So let's begin with the graphic novel. This is Ink Girls, written by Marika Niekamp and illustrated by Sylvia Bai. This is a really sweet story that I think is written for more middle grade, maybe young teenage readers, that follows the adventures of Cinzia. She is a physically disabled printer's apprentice in a world that is based off of the real-life Venice and other Italian Renaissance cities from our world, with a few different tweaks. Cinzia's printing press teacher, I don't know why that was so hard to say what that was. Anyway, her teacher is arrested by the local authorities because she publishes a pamphlet that is criticizing the local government. She's going after corruption, that she sees the powerful aristocrats taking over in a way that is very harmful and exploitative to the other people that are living in this city. So she has kind of an unlikely team up with Elena, who is the young Duchessina, heir to the throne, and Carlotta, a pirate girl, and the three of them work together to try and clear Cinzia's maestra's name and also expose the corruption and the crimes of this ruling family. I thought that this book was okay. I had to keep in mind, though, that, like, these concepts of, democracy and the free press and the importance of a city that is built on trust, or a society that is built on trust and accountability between people, are not new concepts to me, but they might be for someone picking up this book for the very first time. So I think that was, probably something that I had to keep in mind, given that I am not in the target age group for this. I did really like the attention to the historical detail that this book had, and I also loved that it actually had the historically accurate representation of things like the gender and sexuality diversity of the Renaissance period, the racial diversity of a place like Venice, a place on the Mediterranean that's a major seaport, like one of the major seaports of the world during this time period, and also the beautiful sort of cross-disability organizing that happens on the page here. I wouldn't say that, like, disability is necessarily the focal point of this story, but it's definitely a really important element of the story. And that is one of the things that I think Marika Niekamp does very well as a writer as a writer of books for young people, is kind of including that in a way that is meaningful and that contributes to the story, without necessarily making the entire story specifically about disability. So definitely recommend this for the young person in your life. I really liked it. Let's go nonfiction next. So this next book is The Story of a Heart, Two Families, One Heart, and the Medical Miracle That Saved a Child's Life by Dr. Rachel Clark. Found out about this book because of Lena Norms's channel, and to be perfectly honest, I don't think I would have picked it up without her because of the subject matter. It is a very heavy book in terms of subject matter, but it's written with a great deal of sensitivity and respect, and does a wonderful job making sure that we follow the story of this heart in a way that is both marveling at the scientific wonder while also giving a great deal of respect for the dead. So, hard line to toe, definitely a really good read. This also, I believe, just won the Women's Prize for Nonfiction this year, and I can definitely see why. It's actually a pretty slim book that kind of balances these three different narratives. One of them is the story of Kira, a young girl in Britain who tragically loses her life in a car accident and is an organ donor to save the lives of multiple people, including the protagonist of the second narration, Max, a young boy who is very sick because his heart is no longer working properly, and the only thing that can save his life is a heart transplant from another pediatric patient. And then the sort of third through line through this is the more historical analysis of the history of transplant science, the types of medical intervention that let organ donation even be possible, and the stories of the surgeons and other healthcare professionals that like made this happen both in history and for these particular patients. But I really liked this book. I learned a lot from it about the history of transplant science, everything that goes into making sure that these types of surgeries can happen in the way that give the donor's family and, you know, the donor's wishes being honored, as well as the recipient, the best chance at survival that they can possibly get. I looked up a lot of the newspaper articles that were about this case because it was a very high-profile case after I finished reading the book, and I was very pleased and very happy to see that Max has made it to being a teenager and is still doing really well and was able to do this all through the extraordinary gift that Kira gave of her heart and the talent and grace of the surgeons, the nurses, the other healthcare providers to make sure that this could happen. So, really good book. It does deal a lot with child death and trauma, including traumatic death, because unfortunately that is how like most pediatric organ donations happen, is because the child dies very unexpectedly in a tragic way. So be aware of that going in. However, it is definitely worth a read. And let's go ahead and wrap this update up, because it's getting real long, with Whale Eyes, a memoir about seeing and being seen. This is written by James Robinson with illustrations by Brian Rea. And this is one of the books that was on my Disability Pride Month TBR for young readers. This, I think you could probably give to a child maybe as young as 5th or 6th grade, but it's definitely more of an all ages read. I think you could read this at pretty much any stage of your life independently and get something really good out of it. So this follows James Robinson, who is a documentary filmmaker who was born with this condition called strabismus. It means that his eyes don't align in the typical way. So like one is more off to the side and it'll switch depending on like which eye he's sort of focusing more out of. I think I had heard of this, but I didn't really know anything about what it was. So basically his sort of difficulty in seeing comes not from anything that's inherent to his eyes, but the fact that because a lot of vision happens in the brain, if your eyes don't line up, your brain is doing different things in order to try and compensate for that. So this is kind of his memoir about what that was like growing up and how he came into his own identity as a disabled adult. He's also a documentary filmmaker. I did not realize that I had actually seen one of his short films he did for the New York Times. He interviewed a man with a serious stutter about his experience of disability and what that was like. And as part of this book, you also see James's like COVID documentary he made about his own life that was published by the New York Times. What I also really loved about this book was the way in which it challenges the presumably sighted reader to read and experience the book as a material object in the way that James does throughout his life. I am interested to see how this would be adapted for people that are blind or low vision, because so much of the like art in this book presumes that you are already seeing in a typical way. So I'm really curious if this got made into an audiobook, how it would be, how those like more visual parts of the book would be adapted. That would just be really interesting to know about. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was so well written. It had like a great combination of both personal anecdote and then coming into like one's own political identity as a disabled adult. And coming into the power of that word, one of the great things that he said in this book was that calling yourself disabled isn't an admission of weakness, it's a declaration of protection. It's a declaration of saying, these are my people, this is where I belong, this is who I am, and that's something that's worthy of protection, and that's something that's special and good. And I really appreciated this. It was just this kind of quiet declaration that took me completely by storm towards the end of the book. I would definitely recommend this for, like I said, probably 5th or 6th grade on up through. Anybody who's an adult could read this and really get a lot out of it. And if you do read the book, you'll have the link to his short film, but I will put that link as well in the description box, because if you're on the fence, just watch the movie, see what you think. All right, and that is going to just about wrap things up for this wrap-up, which is getting far too long already. If you have read any of these books, please let me know what you thought of them in a comment down below, or tell me about something that you're reading or enjoying through your own summer reading adventures right now. As always, if you like what you see here, feel free to subscribe to my channel, get updated every time I post a new video. As always, thank you all so very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!